It's Tuesday the 29th of July 2004 and we're at the home of Mr John Akhurst, a veteran of the 39th Battalion, V65792 and VX131686. And we're continuing with the Mud Between the Toes series of interviews, and we'd like to welcome you, John, and thank you very much for your time today.
It's a pleasure.
And we'd like to ask you a little bit about pre-war days, so much as your involvement with the 39th Battalion. Could you tell us briefly how you became involved with the 39th Battalion?
Well, I joined the Victorian Scottish in the end of 1938, and I was with the Victorian Scottish and reached the rank of sergeant, and the call came, or the opportunity came, to join the 39th, and I thought it was quite a terrific opportunity, as I thought that it was an untried country. All we'd heard of was the toll officers up there. I imagined the life would be very interesting to see up there, and so I thought it was far more interesting to go to see that and be close at hand if anything happened to Australia, rather than going all the way over to the Middle East.
Can I ask you, John, what uniform did you wear in those days?
In the Victorian Scottish, or
when you joined the 39th, what were you issued with?
When I joined the 39th, I think we arrived, we certainly had our Glengarrys on, and we were issued with standard uniform, the serge, very plain uniform, and slouch hat and so forth.
What about the colour patch? Or
the colour, yes, we got the colour patch, brown over red.
So you got that on your enlistment with the 39th?
Yes, yeah.
Now, how effective was your uniform in relation to the service that you saw in jungle warfare?
Well, as I recall it was khaki in the first instance, and I seem to recall somewhere along the line we had a wash tub on the fire like you used to have when your mother used to do the washing, and we had to dye our uniforms green, and that's how we got to green. Just exactly when that was, I'm not quite sure now.
So it was after you landed in PNG?
I can't tell you that either, but I can remember changing from khaki to green.
What, John, can you comment on how effective your training was prior to going to PNG?
Well, I have. As you know, there was quite a bit of criticism of the 39th, saying they were untrained. I don't agree with that at all. Some of our reinforcements might have been untrained, but the training that we had at Darley, and in my own personal case at the Victorian Scottish before that, was superb. And the old soldiers they were training the reinforcements of the AIF, and they came and officered our battalion, and I thought it was terrific.
Great. What about the trip to New Guinea itself? Can you describe some of the thoughts and feelings about the trip when you got the word to go to...
Well, of course, we were in Darley on the 7th of December when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and so forth, and we were due to go at the end of the month, so things changed dramatically as far as we were concerned, and we knew that we were sort of getting into a bit of trouble. At any rate, we were put on the trains, 2 trains, and we went to Sidney, got off the train at Piermont and went round in the ferry to the Aquitania, which was a magnificent sight. Quite a huge big boat there that we got onto.
Yeah. I heard it was in the harbour with a couple of other escort ships.
No, it was tied up to Woolloomooloo Wharf when we got there, and the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth and the Mauritania were anchored in Sydney Harbour at the time.
Yeah. Quite a sight.
Quite a sight, yeah.
And when you got to PNG, how did you feel about being in another country?
Well, the first thing I noticed, we disembarked just before dusk, or in the afternoon at any rate, was the smell of the place. It had a tropical smell, yep. And all the natives there, they were interesting to see and so forth, and Yes, it was quite good. And of course, you'll have read in the book where the Aquitania had to couldn't get right into the harbour, and we had all these kids diving for the coins that we chucked over the side of the boat.
Yeah. How well equipped did you feel that you were equipped for what lay ahead?
Well, I certainly wasn't very impressed with the Lewis gun, and I would have thought that I'd been to a Tommy gun school at Seymour just before we left, and I would have liked to have seen a few more Tommy guns in our hands, but we were, I would say, ill-equipped.
That's food?
Oh, the food, for about the first fortnight we lived on a bully beef and what we could scrounge. We unloaded the ships, and a great huge pile, you wouldn't imagine how many cases of food we landed or stacked on the sports ground in Port Moresby, and huge, and we used to sneak around and get them. Look, I was always looking for a tin of pineapple, but I couldn't find it, but to get 10 peaches and things like that.
Talking about unloading ships, there's the famous incident of the bombing of the MacDouey.
Yes.
Do you recall that incident?
Well, I certainly do. I wasn't there at the time, but I was a sergeant major at Don Company when that happened, and the sergeant major didn't go in and unload the ship. That was one of his good things that he had about his job. But we did send some fellas in, and some of them were killed, and it wasn't too very pleasant. And I myself was due to go south in the MacDouey to the officers' training school, so I was sorry about that. And the MacDouey, I had been unloading it when I was with A Company, and it was a lovely little ship, beautiful little ship, and very compact and comfortable.
Do you recall when you personally first came under attack?
What, by the bombs or by the...
Well, by either.
By the bombs. Well, of course, it's rather interesting to sort of contemplate that when you see these bombers coming over, and we dug our slit trenches. We were prepared, and we got into the slit trenches, and you sort of wondered how you were going to react when these bombs came down. And of course, being a sergeant, I had to sort of stick my chest out and be brave, you know. But you were a bit concerned about it, because you didn't know how it was going to, what was going to happen. But we found that the slit trenches were very, very efficient, and we lost very few men. But the reactions of some of the men, their nerves were just, they just couldn't stand it. So different people reacted differently.
Did your feelings change over time as the bombing raids increased? Did you become...
No, we were very confident about our slit trenches, and got used to it a bit. And let me tell you, the bombs weren't too far away from where we were, you know. We were just on the side of the drome, and they were bombing the drome. So, you know, we were quite close to it.
Did you lose many people?
No, none. No. Only from nerves.
Right. Did you actually walk the track?
No.
No. But you saw a lot of service on the beaches at Sanananda.
That's correct.
What help did you get from your leaders, subordinates, this time?
Well, I found that up till June, when I was in A Company, we had Captain Badger, who was a bit like Captain Mallory in the old fellas on the Dad's Army. He's just a dead split of Captain Mallory, and he had his likes and his dislikes, and fortunately I was on the good side of him. And his 2IC was Ken Avery. Well, Badger was sent south, and Ken Avery became the company commander, and he was terrific. He was an old First War man, decorated in the First World War. Very, very fine fella.
How was your accommodation when you were serving at Sanananda? Did you sleep out? Did you have,
There was no accommodation. All we had was a gas cape and a ground sheet, and it rained heavily every afternoon, so how you made the best of that I don't know, but that's what we did.
You're constantly wet then.
Constantly, absolutely, absolutely.
So hygiene, sickness would have been a major issue.
The battalion was losing men every day through sickness.
Yeah. And how did you manage to keep in touch with loved ones at home?
Oh, well, I used to write 4 pages home to mum and dad and 3 pages to anyone else.
Right.
And I started off very enthusiastically when I first got up there, and one day when the mail came in I had 23 letters. Well, that took a bit to answer, so I cut down my mailing list.
That must have been very difficult too when you're actually in combat with all the water around.
Oh, I didn't get much mail at all then, no. And what's more, I remember getting a letter, and it was all like as though the censor had been added, but the termites had got to it.
Right. Cut out all the pieces.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you describe the jungle and how you felt about it?
Well, I was very interested in around Port Moresby. I thought when we arrived at Port Moresby we'd see the jungle. It wasn't jungle at all. It was little stubby gum trees. No jungle there at all until you got up to above Rona Falls. But the jungle appealed to me. The tall trees and the beautiful timbers that are in amongst the thing. Yeah.
What about the smells and the noises?
It had a definite smell. I'm not talking about the war smell or anything like that. I'm talking about the natural smell. It was quite pleasant.
Yeah. Did you find it beautiful then?
Yeah, I did.
Rather than menacing?
Yes, I did.
What about the river crossings? Did you experience any?
I didn't have any river crossings in not that I can remember anyway.
Was there any comforts at all? When you was
just discomfort. That's the only comfort you got.
What about mateship?
Mateship, that's a very interesting question. I found, particularly in A Company with my platoon, when they first came into Darley, they were fellas from the country. I've been brought up with a Victorian Scottish with a all spick and span and all that, and these fellas came down with their bandy legs and they've been riding horses all their lives and so forth, and when I lined them up at Darley you could hardly get them in a straight line. But let me tell you this, Doug McLean was my platoon commander at the time. Between him and I, we finished up getting them absolutely superb. So much so that Captain Badger, Mallory, put us in the front of instead of it behind the last company, last platoon, we were put up front when we had to march through when we were on parade at Darley there.
Very good.
Mm. And just further than that, I'd have to say that 9 Platoon was the platoon that was on the Kokoda Plateau, facing the Japanese coming through the rubber plantation, and they were fantastic, and they got 4 military medals.
Yep.
So that was my platoon. So mateship, I reckon they're fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah, it's still going on today, ongoing.
Those fellas, even if you haven't seen them for 3 years or 10 years, you're still just the same.
Yeah. Were you wounded when you were?
No, all I got was malaria, bad malaria, and about 30 or 40 boils and tropical ulcers on my legs, which caused me, and malnutrition, which caused me to be evacuated about the last day in Sanananda.
Were you ever under severe attack?
All the time at Sanananda. Yeah. If you put your head up, you're liable to get it knocked off. And snipers were a very big problem there. And they had they picked out anyone that was in charge. They picked out anyone that had a submachine gun of any sort, and anyone else came last as far as the snipers were concerned. And they were quite active.
I see in a very interesting document you've written about your war experiences. There was an incident at Huggins Road that you...
Oh, well, having just come back from the officers training school, Major Anderson must have thought I was the saviour or something, because he picked on me to go and reconnoitre a track which was going to the north of the Akhurst roadblock, and of course the Japanese were all round the place there. It was surrounded by Japanese, and I had to go and reconnoitre this track, and this was the first time that I'd been put in charge of something like this. I'd done it all in practice, but never the real thing, and I had about, I think in the first instance, about 8 or 10 men probably, I don't know. And I went out and crept along this track, and we found a very well-worn track going at right angles to it, like a T-section. So I went back and reported to Major Anderson. He said, "Right, Sergeant, tomorrow you'll go out there and set up a roadblock, or what do you call them, ambush." So next day, about 20 men this time, and I put them out as I'd been taught with the scouts and everyone, and we crept our way out to this junction. And I just got to the junction, and the scouts had stopped, so I went forward, and I called another sergeant who was at the rear to come up, and we'd placed the men where we were going to set our ambush. And I'm just, we just got there, and I see this moving bush, and there was about 3 or 4 Japs coming along the track with foliage on their hat. I couldn't believe my eyes. So I had my Owen gun, which we'd just been issued with, and I let the Owen gun go, 32 rounds, or how many rounds it is, about 32, into this group of Japanese. And I ran out of ammunition, and I looked round to see if the sergeant would keep on firing while I changed my magazine, and he wasn't there. So there was no time to change my magazine, so I flipped back. I don't know how I got there, back along the track which we'd come, about 10 yards or so, and into the side, and the ground was spurting up with things, and eventually it quietened down, and I put my finger to my mouth and told the fellas to withdraw, and that's what happened.
So they put a blasted machine gun into the forest where you were?
Well, whether it was a machine gun or what it was, I don't know. But I have to tell you that it was a sight to see these fellas with their eyes like this when I'm looking back at them, you know. They were absolutely scared stiff anyway. We got out of it all right. And Major Anderson wanted me to go out the next day, and some of my friends, whether they saw Captain Gilmore or however, but he said, "No, you don't need to go," because I was dead scared that if I had to go out again the next day, they'd be waiting for me, and it wouldn't be too good.
When you became ill towards the end of the Sanananda campaign, how were you cared for?
Oh, well, you just cared for yourself. I didn't realise how ill I was till, I don't know how it happened, but the next thing I'm told to, you're going to be evacuated, and I was taken to the casualty clearing station and on a jeep to Papua and flown to Port Moresby, and I was in the hospital there for about perhaps a day and a half, and the next minute I'm on the hospital ship Sanananda and sent back south, and they looked after me very well. And the best thing I had, of all the things that I can remember, was when I got onto that hospital ship. I had a bunk on the deck there, and the nurse came along and she gave me a nice fresh orange, and I hadn't had an orange out of the fridge for about 6 or 9 months.
Was that the end of your service with the 39th Battalion when you were evacuated with that illness?
No, well, yes, the end of the service. I returned to the 39th when they were on the tablelands, but no more fighting with them. I went to the 2nd 8th after that.
You went to 2nd 8th when they were disbanded?
Mm.
We talked, John, about your being evacuated out of Sanananda. Prior to becoming ill and being evacuated. How did you find your health in those days? Were you conscious of your health?
Well, yeah, well, our meals were quite sort of ordinary, and I wasn't really conscious of my health at all, except that the conditions were frightful. And
at the time, what about sleep?
Sleep, well, it rained all night, and how I kept the rain out with the gas cape and the ground sheet, I don't know, but I do know that when you put the gas cape on, you perspired, and then you're just as wet inside as if you had no gas cape on at all.
Yeah. You talked before about how horrific the battle at Sanananda was.
Yeah.
The casualties there.
The conditions.
Were you aware at the time of how bad it was, or was it only something?
Well, it was like World War One. And we're in these little foxholes. If you put your head up, you're liable to get it off. After we got out of Huggins, we went round to a very open section where we had 24 hours on and 24 hours off, and the time you're off, you're away from the action. When you're on, you're right up there, and you just couldn't. You're in the hole with water up to your neck all day. At night time, you get out and lay along the side, and you're wet, but you'd see these fellas in the Wirraways going along up there and going back to their nice dry places back behind the lines there. You'd think, well, I certainly aren't in the right spot here. Yes, it wasn't too good.
You think people back home had any understanding of what you experienced?
Not the slightest. No. Still don't.
No. What about counselling after the war?
Didn't get any of that.
There was no counselling?
No. What's that?
Yeah. Yeah. How do you respond to Japanese contact later on?
Well, as I said, or as I say, we went on a pilgrimage to in 1972, and we went on to Japan, and the Australian Embassy arranged for us to meet some of the fellows that we were fighting, and I met General Tanaka, and he gave me his card, and a few others too, but Tanaka and I had quite a chat, and he was at Sanananda too, and we reckon we were in about 400 yards of one another, and he said, well, I'm glad I didn't hit you, and I said, I'm glad I didn't hit you too. But it boiled down to the fact that he was doing what he was told, and we were doing what we were told, and we had no option.
What do you think is really important to remember about the New Guinea campaign?
Well, that's a very big question, and I'm not going to go into great details about it, but I have to say that the organisation of supplies and things for the Australian Army and the weapons that they gave them to pretty near impossible ability was absolutely found wanting. And some of the things that the 39th Battalion and the others were asked to do were absolutely ridiculous.
John, about relationships with other people in PNG, such as the Papuan infantry and the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels.
Well, some Major Watson, I knew him. He was in charge of the Papua New Guinea PIB, the battalion. But I didn't really have much to do with him. I just knew him, and we knew one another to talk to. But as to the Papuans themselves, well, you couldn't talk to them or I couldn't talk to them because they couldn't speak English in those days. They were all Motuan, and you just couldn't converse with them, not like you can these days.
Were there chaplains attached to your company?
No, we had Father Earl. I was the RSM when he came into the battalion, when he turned up with his case of whiskey and made himself very popular with the colonel. But no, he was our quite very fine fellow too, Padre Earl.
Was he attached to the Salvation Army?
No, he was a Roman Catholic priest who'd come from one of the, I forget the name of the island, away off Samurai, and he'd come in and landed at Port Moresby, and they wanted to send him south, and he didn't want to go south, and he got appointed to the 39th Battalion.
See, was their work of value, do you think? The work that he did, was that of value?
Absolutely, absolutely. Fearless and did all that was asked of him. And he he was non-denominational, you know, he was attended to everyone.
When you talk about fear, and you're in the middle of battle, do you ever think about home and you're only thinking about the moment?
Yeah. Well, of course, you've got time to ponder when things are quiet, but when things are going, you've got no time to think about that at all. But of course, you do get a lot of time to ponder because you're not always active.
What about good times? Do you remember any mischief you got into?
I was a very good boy. I was a sergeant. I had to set an example.
You set the example. Should have asked that question. Okay. What do you think is important for future generations to know about your 39th Battalion efforts in PNG?
Well, the first thing you've got to do is have a good leader, and I reckon Colonel Honor was fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. He was head and shoulders above all the others, and he hardly ever made a mistake. And he was very experienced, as we know, but he also looked after his men, which is a great thing. What else they need to do? They need to make sure that they're well trained, that they have the proper weapons before they ever set out. And if I was my son, I'd never have him join the infantry. I think there's other places in the Army or the Air Force or the Navy which are much more comfortable.
What about the future generations to today? What would you like them to take from what you experienced?
Well, I think the 39th set a pretty good example, and that was brought about by largely by Colonel Honor and some of his subordinate officers. But I put it down to Colonel Honor, and if they can learn to have people like that leading them, they can go anywhere. And the main thing, which you've got to do when you get in a situation in the Army, you've got to bond with people, and you've got to have. You certainly need it, and you seem to be able to always have someone that's a good mate of yours wherever you are. But my experience with the 9 Platoon A Company, those fellas would have gone anywhere, and I would have gone anywhere with them, and that's how you want to be.
You talked, John, about Captain Honor.
Colonel Honor, yeah.
Honor, sorry. Who other leaders? What other leaders would impressed you during your time?
Well, I have to tell you that not at Sanananda, but Sam Templeton. When I first joined the Victorian Scottish, he was my Sergeant Major, and he sort of got me into step with the Army. And later on, he got a commission, and he was my platoon commander, and I was his sergeant, so I got to know him quite well. And he really became very famous with what he achieved over at Oivy and those places. But he left the Victorian Scottish and he went to the training battalion, and he went from the training battalion to us, and that's but he was a very hard man to sort of a very private man, but I always got on all right with him.
It's now 60 years since the end of the war.
Yeah.
And you're still involved with the 39th Battalion Association. Has that meant much to you over the years?
Well, in the first instance, when I left the Army, I said, that's it. But later on, Russell Rosengreen and Alf Salmon got me to join up, and I've thoroughly enjoyed being with the association ever since. And Jim Hardy sort of asked me would I come onto the committee. Well, I wasn't too anxious to come on the committee, but seeing that he asked me and he was doing such a good job, I thought, well, perhaps I could do that, and that's how I've been on the committee. That's how I got on the committee.
Still there today?
Still there today.
Working.
I don't know whether I'm any use to the committee, but I'm there.
Working for the veterans that are left.
That's right, yes. 200 of them now, I believe.
We've had recent publications printed, ongoing publications about the Kokoda campaign.
Yes.
One of the more recent ones is a book by Peter Brune called A Blast of a Place.
Yes.
Do you see a place for that book?
I do. I think that I think the Army should take that book up. There are many lessons in that book which could be well learnt, and the mistakes that are noted there should never be repeated.
What about for the general public?
I think the losses and so forth that are in that book and the figures that they quote are appalling.
Perhaps too brutal for general.
Too brutal, I think. I mean, when you consider that there's as many people, the battalion itself lost nearly as many people as were lost in the Vietnam War. So, I mean, it's really horrific.
John, do you remember where you were when the news reached you that the war against Japan was over?
Yes, I can tell you that. I was an M Special Unit. That's a division of the Australian Intelligence Bureau, the Z Special Unit and M Special Unit. And I was in M Special Unit up in Darwin, and we were about to set off for Darley Camp, and the news came through that the bomb had dropped and they'd capitulated. So we had quite a bit of water transport and so forth up there. You can understand that M Special Unit provided Z Special Unit with all their equipment. So we had work boats and goodness knows what. So one of the boys teed up that we go around and pick up the nurses around at the hospital. And we chuffed off round to the hospital there in the boat, and we're going to have a very merry night. But unfortunately, the matron was awake up to us and said, "No way!" And that's what happened on VE night.
Right. Is there anything that we haven't asked you that you'd like to say for this tape? We're going to go to the archives at the Canberra War Memorial.
Well, I'd like to say that for me it was a privilege to be in the 39th Battalion, to have achieved what they achieved from what they started with was absolutely superb. I think they were very harshly dealt with being sent up there, and I would have said that they were sort of wiped off by those in charge, because they thought that they would be overwritten by the Japanese and there was no point in reinforcing them. But after the Coral Sea battle and so forth, and they had a bit of a change of heart, and the place was reinforced, and the 39th was right in the heart of it. And looking back 60 years back, I think that they did things that I never thought was possible.